Global public debt has reached the highest level in recorded history. The unprecedented fiscal policy response of 11 trillion US dollars worldwide has pushed global public debt to reach a record high, according to the IMF. To quote Vitor Gaspar, director of the IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department, and Gita Gopinath, IMF's chief economist, in a blog, quote, "In the face of a sharp decline in global output, a massive fiscal response has been necessary to increase health capacity, replace lost household income, and prevent large-scale bankruptcies." Quote, "But the policy response has also contributed to global public debt reaching its highest level in recorded history, at over 100% of global GDP, in excess of post-World War II peaks. They say the need for more fiscal stimulus is, quote, clear as countries gradually reopen. Quote, but this begs the question of how countries can finance it without debt becoming unsustainable. Fiscal deficits are expected to be at least 5 times higher in advanced economies and to more than double in emerging market economies, leading to an unprecedented jump in public debt of many percentage points, like more than 25 percentage points. Public debt is thought to, quote, stabilize in 2021 due to low interest rates and a projected strong rebound in economic activity, according to the authors, who say, quote, there is a great diversity in debt levels and financing abilities across the countries and high uncertainty surrounding the forecasts. Borrowing costs can increase rapidly, particularly for emerging economies and frontier markets, as was the case in March. The assurance of a, quote, path back to sustainable fiscal balances for countries would be key in countries that enter this crisis with already elevated debt and low growth. Quote, governments will need to pursue a credible, medium-term fiscal plan that relies on improving revenue mobilization, including through minimizing tax avoidance, greater tax progressivity, carbon pricing, and higher efficiency in spending. 72 countries so far have received IMF emergency assistance, quote, but far more bilateral and multilateral support will be needed, added the authors. Now, the IMF has said that more stimulus is needed despite world record public debt levels, as we've gone over. They say that although public debt has swelled to the highest in history, the IMF warns that cutting stimulus could undermine the recovery and that continuing support as the economic slowdown continues will be, quote, paramount. This according to Gaspar in an interview. Quote, the risk of premature withdrawal of fiscal support is the dominant risk, more so than rising debt levels. In response to lockdown, governments provided, quote, a massive fiscal response of close to 11 trillion in but a few months to support households and prevent bankruptcies. This, quote, stronger and faster response than 2008 to 2010 resulted in a record low interest rate and world record-breaking levels of debt. Global public debt will reach its, quote, highest level as a percentage of GDP ever recorded in history, as more than 100% of global GDP is registered. The deficits of advanced economies are expected to reach 5 times higher than pre-pandemic levels that were estimated originally for 2020. The IMF is urging authorities to flood their countries with cash. The IMF's Gaspar and chief economist Gopinath say that government spending will, quote, need to remain supportive and flexible until a safe and durable exit from the crisis is secured. They caution, quote, we are not out of the woods. Authorities should shore up their finances by improving tax collection by taxing those with higher incomes more, while eliminating subsidies on fuel and adopting revenue measures such as carbon pricing. Governments are facing, quote, profound transformations of their economies as, quote, many of the jobs destroyed by the crisis will likely not return. Governments should focus on sectors that will survive rather than those that will shrink, such as air travel. IMF officials suggest new stimulus could even entail governments taking equity stakes or even nationalizing industries, which would, quote, allow the taxpayer to share the upside in companies benefiting from the government support. The IMF thinks governments might even use an equity-like stimulus. IMF chief economist Gopinath advises governments to implement equity-like support instead of loans as firms increasingly become insolvent due to lower revenues over extended periods. Her reasoning is government support in the form of loans would hurt companies due to the debt, which would be a form of tax in her view. Quote, because there's a bigger insolvency issue here, government support would have to shift more towards being equity-like as opposed to debt-like. Otherwise, you would end up with a lot of firms that exit this crisis with a huge amount of debt overhang. If the lending takes form more like equity, then that's less onus on the firms. That will make it easier for firms to recover from the crisis. During the late 1990s, the Japanese government injected capital into firms via schemes where state-affiliated bodies bought preferred shares issued by these firms. According to Gopinath, the global economic recovery will be, quote, highly uneven and highly uncertain. Aggressive fiscal and monetary stimulus measures are needed to support economies. She notes that food price inflation has increased in some countries, though consumer inflation will be curbed by job losses and stagnant wages. Quote, we have more concerns of inflation going too low, rather than inflation going too high. In the IMF's view, the coming depression, though they call it a recession, will be as bad as the 1930s Great Depression. In its latest projections, the IMF expects 2020 global output to shrink 4.9%, compared with 3% contractions predicted in April. Now, the lockdown response might push 100 million into poverty. The worst global economic crisis since World War II might push up to 100 million people into poverty, according to the World Bank. The International Financial Institution estimates that global GDP could fall by up to 5% in 2020, sending 100 million people into poverty. Ihan Ko's, director of World Bank's Prospects Group, foresees mass poverty ahead. Quote, this year we will see the highest share of economies experiencing declines in their per capita income. Of course, this means poverty outcomes are going to get worse, and we are projecting anywhere between 70 and 100 million people basically becoming poor. Countries must now focus on not only controlling the pandemic, but also, quote, aggressive fiscal measures. Coase continued, quote, policymakers need to address the immediate crisis, allocate resources, aggressively undertake measures so they can contain the pandemic. The second thing they will need to do, of course, will require aggressive fiscal measures stimulating these economies and aggressive monetary policy measures. Leading international organizations, meanwhile, on nutrition, including Action Against Hunger Concern Worldwide, the Eleanor Crook Foundation, the International Rescue Committee, and World Vision, wrote a letter to UN member states urging them to recognize how the world is, quote, off track to meet one particular goal, nutrition. They fear increased risk of malnutrition and what the organizations call wasting in children, which is low weight for height, which is also a strong predictor of mortality among children under 5, poses a great risk. 50 million children are malnourished around the world, they point out. These numbers, which are expected to increase as a result of COVID-19, can only be diminished if government increase their malnutrition programs. The UN High-Level Political Forum is being held July 7th through July 16th. The theme is, quote, accelerated action and transformative pathways, realizing the decade of action and delivery for sustainable development. The organizations criticized the UNLPF 2020 for not discussing the need to increase access to high-impact nutrition services such as treatment for wasting. The organization notes that the underlying cause of 50% of all deaths in children under 5 and severe malnutrition increases a child's risk of death up to 12-fold. Prior to the pandemic, 135 million people faced acute food shortages in 2019, and now the World Food Program predicts an additional 130 million people could go hungry in 2020, suggesting, quote, 265 million people, double that of 2019, could be pushed to the brink of starvation by year-end. Child wasting could increase by as much as 14%, according to the nutrition organizations. Thanks for watching today. Have a great day.